The sun spilled over the dusty gravel of the backlot like a secret whispered too late. Clint Eastwood stepped out of his trailer, not with his usual easy gait, but with something more deliberate. In his hand, a black envelope, thick and sealed, edges worn like an old keepsake. No one dared ask. Not the director, not the assistant who'd spilled coffee in front of him that morning. Clint's silence, revered and sharp, made the envelope sacred. Even the extras, toughened by years of forgettable roles, felt it. Something was different. As he approached the camera, the hum of the set faded. The envelope never left his grasp. That day, the scene wasn't memorable. But Clint was. Not because of what he said, but what he didn't. What secret did Clint Eastwood bring that day? And why did it change everything for a grieving veterinarian named Scott White? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after Clint Eastwood's silent appearance with the black envelope, a strange kind of electricity still lingered around the clinic. Scott White woke up earlier than usual, his thoughts restless and oddly tangled. He wasn't a man given to superstition or drama, but something about the actor's wordless gesture had unsettled him. It wasn't just the envelope, it was the weight behind it, the aura of unfinished business. Scott arrived at the clinic before sunrise, coffee in one hand, a manila folder in the other. Inside the folder were Charlie's records, still incomplete, still mysterious. His fingers brushed the scratched metal tag he'd placed inside a plastic evidence pouch. He felt a growing itch in his mind, like a story half told and impatient to be finished. The soft meow from the back confirmed Charlie was awake too. Scott stepped quietly into the feline ward. The other animals were still sleeping, but Charlie sat alert in his kennel, those green eyes luminous and fixed on Scott with a gaze far too knowing for a domestic cat. "Morning, buddy," Scott whispered, crouching beside him. "You've stirred up quite the mess, haven't you?" Charlie blinked slowly and then let out a single, pointed meow that sounded suspiciously like a yes. Scott reached into his pocket and pulled out a treat. Charlie accepted it delicately, then resumed his silent watch. The cat was calmer now than he had been the day before, after Emily's visit. Scott had observed the shift in demeanor, the transformation from wary and agitated to quiet and almost peaceful. The name still haunted him, Emily Harrington, and the other name that had resurfaced in the clinic overnight, from an anonymous email sent to the main inbox. Mason. Not just Grace Carter's married name, Mason Industries, a defunct company known for its proprietary tech in RFID tracking for pets and humans alike. That name had shown up in veterinary forums years ago, flagged during a short-lived scandal about privacy tagging in test animals. A long-abandoned prototype. A cat that seemed to know too much. A family with connections to a vanished tech firm. And now Clint Eastwood with a black envelope. Scott stood abruptly. Something wasn't adding up. Emily Harrington hadn't slept. Not properly. Not since she'd held Charlie again for those brief minutes before Grace Carter had walked into the clinic lobby. She knew, the moment she touched Charlie's fur and felt that unmistakable rumbling purr, that he remembered her. 6 years was nothing in the language of the heart. She'd spent all those years mourning him, cursing herself for letting him slip away during the chaos of that cross-state move. She'd plastered signs on telephone poles, posted on forums, driven miles following every vague lead. And now, not only had he survived, he had thrived. But not alone. He had belonged to someone else, too. Grace had not been cruel. Quite the opposite. Emily saw it in the woman's eyes. The grief of a widow whose only solace had been this furry, intuitive companion. She had not stolen Charlie. She had saved him. And now they both had to decide how to move forward. Emily poured her coffee slowly, trying not to spill it as her hands trembled. She looked again at the printed email Scott had forwarded her that morning. He'd blind copied it from the clinic's inbox, clearly hoping she'd see something he didn't. The collar tag was only the beginning. He was part of something bigger. Ask about the EMP signature. Mason knew. Check behind the name. See, that was it. No explanation, no follow-up. But Emily knew enough to understand one thing. Someone else knew about Charlie. And what had once been just a cat lost and found might actually be something darker. She grabbed her phone and dialed Scott at the clinic. 9:12 a.m. "You're sure it said EMP signature?" Scott asked, putting the call on speaker as Emma entered the room. "Positive," Emily said. "Do you think it's a hoax?" Emma froze. EMP? Like electromagnetic pulse? That sounds more like military than veterinary. Scott narrowed his eyes. Unless Mason Industries was testing RFID in animals. It wasn't just tracking, it was dynamic behavioral feedback. There were rumors about neurological influence using pulsed EM signals. "That sounds like science fiction," Emily said softly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Most things do until they're real," Emma muttered, eyeing Charlie warily. The cat, for his part, had begun pacing inside the kennel. Not erratic, measured, like a ritual. It was the same pattern he'd done twice before. Walk to the back, press nose to corner, circle twice, pause, again and again. Scott watched him carefully. What if that's a memory loop? A behavioral pattern triggered by some residual signal? Emma frowned. "He did this the day Francis died, too. Same behavior. I thought it was grief." "Could be," Scott said. "But what if it's both? Grief and signal interference?" He walked to the computer. "I want to scan the tag again." "High frequency." Emma raised her eyebrows. "We don't have that kind of equipment." "I know someone who does." Professor Julian Hartley owed Scott a favor. Several, in fact. When his lab dog had developed a rare autoimmune condition 2 years ago, Scott had treated him without charge. Now, Julian worked in a biomedical research lab with access to equipment Scott could only dream of. "This tag's old," Julian said, turning it under a magnifying scope. "But there's something weird. Look at the etching. This wasn't done by accident. It's not scratched. It was deliberately scored to hide part of the serial number." Scott's pulse quickened. "Can you reconstruct it?" Julian smiled. "Already did." He turned the screen. A serial string blinked in red. MHX 9411, KEWRM, Charlie 01, MHX, Julian said. "That's Mason's prototype series. EWRM could stand for External Wireless Response Module. And Charlie 01? "First of its kind," Scott whispered. Julian nodded grimly. "They didn't just tag your cat, Scott. They embedded something. Deeper. These codes are tied to a neural response experiment. Very hush-hush. Some of Mason's execs were under federal watch when they closed. That cat may have been one of the only living test subjects." Scott leaned back. "Which means Grace and Emily both have no idea what they've been living with." "And neither do you," Julian added. "Be careful." Scott's phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Grace is here. She's crying. Says she's remembered something. You need to come now." Scott didn't waste another second. Grace sat on the floor of the exam room. Eyes red, hands trembling. She looked smaller today. Her grief no longer fresh, but clawing and lingering like an echo. "He did something the night Francis died," she said softly. "Charlie. He ran to the study and stood by Francis's desk. Wouldn't move. I followed, and I swear, it was like he was trying to get me to open something." Scott knelt. "What did you find?" She looked up, expression haunted. "A file. Mason Industries. I thought it was from Francis's past consulting work. I didn't even connect it. But now, Now I think he knew. He must have known who Charlie really was. Where's the file now? I burned it, she whispered, out of grief. I didn't want anything reminding me of business or death. I was trying to survive, Scott nodded gently. You did what you had to, but now we have to find out what Charlie's still carrying. For his sake, and yours. Charlie meowed. Low. Intense. It was time to confront the past. Together, Caditius' air in the exam room was heavy, not with illness, but with revelation. Charlie perched silently beside Grace, eyes flicking between her and Scott with uncanny awareness. In his posture, there was no fear, no confusion, only patience, as if he'd been waiting years for this moment. Scott stood slowly. Grace, we need to get Charlie back to the lab. There's something in his collar, some kind of embedded response module. He may have been part of an experiment by Mason Industries. You said Francis worked with them? Grace nodded, her face a mixture of grief and realization. Briefly, he was a freelance analyst, mostly for mergers and IP auditing. He always said Mason was hiding something. But I never knew he meant this. Scott turned to Emma. Prep. Charlie for transport. We're heading to Westside again. Emma hesitated. Should we tell Emily? Scott sighed. She deserves to know. She's part of this now, whether she expected it or not. Grace didn't speak, but her nod was firm. Emily sat on her porch with a notebook, flipping through old journal entries. Her notes from 6 years ago read like love letters to a ghost. Entries about Charlie's habits, his odd behaviors, the times he would stare at blank walls or follow unseen paths through their apartment. At the time, she'd chalked it up to feline curiosity. Now, she wondered if he'd been reacting to more than shadows. Her phone buzzed. Scott. She answered before the second ring. We've confirmed it, he said. Charlie's tag isn't just a tag. It's part of an RFID response module, likely tied to Mason Industries' experimental program. Grace just admitted Francis had files on the company, and she remembers Charlie acting strangely the night he died. Emily clutched the notebook to her chest. What does this mean for him? Is he sick? No, Scott replied gently. He's not sick, but he's holding something, maybe even some kind of stored memory or data. We're taking him to a lab to run a deep scan. You should come. There was no hesitation. I'll be there in 15. Professor Julian Hartley had prepped the equipment the moment Scott called. The lab, normally used for biomedical simulations, was quiet, low-lit, and sterile, a stark contrast to the emotional weight Charlie brought with him as Emma gently placed the cat on a padded table, fitted with sensors that wouldn't harm or restrain him. Julian adjusted the scanner. This won't hurt. It's just an electromagnetic sweep. If there's a memory storage element or an active signal, we'll find it. Charlie didn't resist. He sat, purring softly, tail wrapped neatly around his paws. The scanner beeped. To life. Grace and Emily stood side by side behind the observation glass, watching intently. Neither spoke, but every shared glance carried volumes. In another world, perhaps they would have been enemies. Two women forced to argue over custody of a cat. But here, in the flicker of machine lights, they were something else. Witnesses, survivors, mothers, in a strange sense, to the same creature. A bar on the screen spiked suddenly. Julian leaned forward. That's it. He's responding to a pulsed magnetic field. There's a chipset inside the collar, and wait, there's more. A sequence of digits filled the screen. Julian frowned. These aren't system diagnostics. They're coordinates. Scott stepped forward. Coordinates to what? Julian typed rapidly. Let's find out. Within seconds, a map appeared on the screen. A wooded property, 10 miles west of town. Land registered under Francis A. Carter, marked as inactive since his death. A cabin stood in the center, barely visible beneath overgrowth. Scott's breath caught. He kept a property. Grace, did you know about this? Grace stared at the screen, her face pale. No, I had no idea. Emily turned to her. Do you think he was hiding something there? I don't know, Grace murmured. But Charlie clearly does. Charlie meowed. Twice. Loudly. It was the first time he'd vocalized since arriving at the lab. The road to the cabin was rough and winding, flanked by tall evergreens and half-forgotten fencing. Scott, Grace, and Emily rode together in Scott's SUV, with Charlie in a secure carrier beside them. Emma followed close behind in her own car, carrying extra supplies and a portable medical kit. The cabin was almost invisible until they were right in front of it, an old timber structure, weathered by time but still intact. Vines crept up the sides and leaves carpeted the porch. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. This doesn't feel right, Grace whispered. Scott parked. Let's find out what Charlie's trying to show us. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust hung in lazy beams through boarded-up windows. Furniture stood under white sheets like forgotten ghosts. Charlie meowed again, insistent. Scott opened the carrier. The cat sprang out immediately and began to walk, not aimlessly, but with intent. They followed him through the cabin, past the kitchen, down a narrow hallway to a small study. He stopped at a bookcase, then turned to face them. He did this. At home, too, Grace said, the night Francis died. Scott knelt and examined the bookcase. A small indentation in the wood revealed a hidden latch. With a soft click, the case swung open to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into the basement. Jesus, Emma muttered. It's a bunker. They descended carefully. The basement was lined with file cabinets, a workbench, and what looked like a prototype testing area. Old Mason logos covered some of the hardware. In the corner, a small steel safe stood open. Inside were files, a flash drive, and a black envelope. Emily gasped. Scott stepped forward and carefully lifted the envelope. It was identical to the one Clint Eastwood had carried onto the set. Why would Eastwood have something like this? Emma whispered. Scott opened it. Inside was a typed letter. To whom it may concern. If you're reading this, then Charlie has succeeded in completing the final phase of his behavioral pattern loop. He was never meant to carry the burden of memory. But sometimes memory is safer in something no one would suspect. Mason Industries failed to control consciousness transfer. We lost humans. We lost animals. But Charlie survived because he adapted. He absorbed not just data, but emotion. Memory isn't just digital. It's sensory, tactile, felt. Francis knew the truth. So did Eastwood. You'll find what you need on the flash drive. But know this, the world will never believe you unless Charlie shows them. Sometimes love is the key to unlocking everything. Silence followed. Scott slid the flash drive into a nearby laptop. Video files, notes, scans of neural pathways in animals, mapped with emotion-based triggers. Test logs showing Charlie responding to both owners over time. His identity bending, but never breaking. And then, security footage. A dated recording showed Francis Carter in the cabin basement. He stood with Charlie in his arms. He's the last, Francis said to the camera. The only one who didn't break. Whatever Mason put in him, it evolved. It healed. He's more than memory. He's proof that empathy can survive replication. He smiled faintly, and I think he knows it. Word had spread, not of the flash drive, not of the letter, but of Charlie, the miracle cat who had returned home to 2 families. No reporters knew the full story, and Scott intended to keep it that way. But quietly, carefully, he began cataloging the data with Julian, building a case not for media, exposure but for scientific ethics review. Mason Industries had been shut down for a reason, but their legacy would not be forgotten. Grace and Emily now shared custody of Charlie. He stayed 1 week at a time at each home, transitioning with ease. He remembered both, loved both, and they, in turn, learned to love each other through him. Sometimes the clinic would get calls from people asking if they could meet Charlie, as though he were a celebrity. Scott always said the same thing. He's not a symbol, he's just a cat, but he might be the most important cat we've ever met. Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the soundstage, the black envelope in his hand once more. This time he opened it. Inside was a photograph. Grace, Emily, Scott, and Charlie, seated in the sun outside the clinic, smiling. He slipped the photo into his coat, then turned and walked away, leaving the envelope empty on the ground. Sometimes the greatest stories were the ones no one ever heard. The sound of rain against the clinic's windows blurred the edges of the morning. Soft, gray light filtered into the exam room where Charlie lay curled beside the radiator, breathing deeply, his tail wrapped tightly around himself. There was a stillness to him, a meditative calm that belied the storm both outside and within. Scott. White sat at his desk, hands folded over a stack of reports. The flash drive from Francis Carter's cabin had opened a doorway to a world no one had known existed, or rather, one that powerful interests had worked hard to erase. He glanced at the whiteboard across the room. Scribbled across it were phrases like behavioral pattern, loop 7A, consciousness encoding trials, series M, Charlie, control subject, Eastwood's role. But one question circled again and again in Scott's mind. Why? Charlie. Why did he survive? A knock interrupted his thoughts. Emma pushed the door open. "You've got a visitor." Scott raised an eyebrow. "Emily?" Emma shook her head. "No, someone else. Says he's with the Department of Ethical Biotech Oversight. Agent Rowan." Scott's stomach dropped. "Government. Send him in," he said quietly. A moment later, a tall man entered, broad-shouldered, dark suit, quiet demeanor. His badge glinted faintly from his lapel. "Dr. Scott White?" he asked. "That's right. I'm Agent Miles Rowan. I need to speak to you about the Mason Industries data you recovered." Scott didn't ask how he knew. There was no point. The flash drive had been offline, but metadata had a way of leaking. "You're aware this was unauthorized experimentation," Rowan continued, stepping into the room with calculated calm. "Mason Industries was dissolved a decade ago after multiple breaches in animal rights laws, not to mention human fatalities during early-stage consciousness experiments." Scott remained seated. "And yet, somehow, you let them build a private testing facility, use untraceable field agents, and fund prototype trials like the one involving Charlie." Rowan didn't blink. "We didn't know about Charlie. We suspected Mason still had projects buried in black sites, but this is something else. A living subject exhibiting retention, emotional association, and adaptive behavior integration over a 6-year undocumented period?" He leaned forward. "This isn't just a memory carrier. It's a sentient archive." Scott looked down at Charlie. "He's not a weapon." "No," Rowan agreed, "but he's a precedent." Charlie's rotation schedule had settled into a rhythm. 1 week with Emily, 1 week with Grace. Today was Emily's turn. The apartment was quiet, warm. Books stacked on the coffee table, tea cooling in a ceramic mug. Emily sat on the floor beside Charlie's carrier, brushing his fur gently. He purred softly, head butting her wrist every few strokes. She thought back to the basement, Francis's hidden lab, the letter, the footage. There was so much they hadn't understood, so much she still wrestled with. How do you reconcile the fact that the cat you loved was part of a corporate experiment? That the creature who comforted you through loss and loneliness had been carrying someone else's secrets all along? Her phone buzzed. "Grace, can we talk today? I've remembered something about the night Francis died." Emily frowned and typed back, "Of course. Come by?" "Grace, on my way." Emily looked down at Charlie. "Ready for another round of surprises, love?" Charlie lifted. His head meowed once and then lay back down, eyes half closed but alert. Agent Rowan stayed longer than Scott expected. Not hostile, but insistent. He wanted all the files, the full scan records, even the collar, but Scott refused to hand anything over until he could verify Rowan's credentials through the university and his own lawyer. "We have witnesses to Mason's cover-up," Scott said. "We have a cat whose behavior shows more complexity than anything I've seen in my career. This isn't just a data dump. This is intelligence." Rowan stood. "You're right, Doctor. Which is exactly why this can't go public yet. You don't understand the scope." "Try me," Scott said, tone steady. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. "You ever hear of Project Orpheus?" Scott shook his head. It was Mason's final phase. They stopped trying to create artificial consciousness and started trying to preserve real ones. Terminal patients, soldiers with memory loss, children with trauma. They tested uploading their neural impressions into animals as temporary vessels, living vaults able to hold fragments until they could be reintegrated into human substrates. Scott's mouth went dry. "And Charlie?" Rowan nodded. "Could be the only successful case." Grace stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her coat. Emily welcomed her in and handed her a towel. "I brought some of Francis's journals," Grace said quietly, "and I think I found something you should see." They sat at the kitchen table while Charlie wandered between them, brushing against both of their legs. Grace opened a leather-bound notebook, pages brittle with age and scrawled with tightly written entries. "Here," she said, flipping to one marked Deck 14. Charlie responded to the voice again. "Not mine. Emily's." Her name triggered something. Not like a memory, more like recognition. Is it possible we're seeing integration rather than transfer? He's not a copy. He's a bridge. Emily read the lines twice. "He remembered me?" Grace nodded. "I think so, but I think it's deeper than that. Francis thought Charlie was trying to reconcile both lives, yours and ours, that he wasn't just a passenger. He was a participant." Emily swallowed hard. "Which means he chose us both." Charlie leapt into her lap, curling tightly. Neither woman said anything for a while. Then Grace asked, "Do you think he dreams?" Emily looked down at him. "Yes, and I think his dreams belong to all of us." Julian Hartley had been working around the clock. The flash drive had contained more than video logs. It included raw code, procedural algorithms for something called ME7 Neural Stamping Protocol, the memory engine. "It's theoretical," Julian told Scott, pointing to the monitor. "But this is what Mason was working on. You can take an individual's neural pattern, compress it, and encode it across multiple nodes, biological or synthetic. Think of it like splitting a soul into Horcruxes, but science-based." Scott grimaced. "Terrifying analogy." Julian chuckled. "But accurate. The problem was that no host could retain stable memory without neurological degradation." "Except Charlie," Scott said. Julian nodded. "Exactly. He didn't just retain. He blended, he contextualized, and he didn't go mad." Scott stared at the data, his mind racing. "Do you think he still has fragments of Francis in him?" Julian considered. "Not directly, but behaviorally, possibly, emotionally, almost certainly." Scott tapped the screen. "What if we could extract that?" "You mean, talk to Francis? Or what's left of him?" Julian's face went pale. "You're talking about biofeedback translation. That would take months to develop. Then we better get started." In a glass-walled office deep inside a Washington, D.C. building, a man watched Charlie's footage through secure feeds. Dr. Victoria Eng, head of the Retained Intelligence Division, stood behind him. "Rowan was right," she said. "Charlie isn't an accident. He's a keystone." The man, graying and silent, turned slowly. "Then we find out how many others there are. We reopen Orpheus. Quietly." And the veterinarian? We watch him. And if he gets too close, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The rain had turned into a cold mist. Scott stood in his living room, the walls dim with amber lamplight. Charlie lay sprawled on a patch of rug, eyes half closed. Scott sipped lukewarm coffee, mind heavy with what they'd uncovered. He replayed Julian's warning. You're talking about biofeedback translation. That would take months to develop, and yet the urgency throbbed louder each day. If what Agent Rowan said was true, if Project Orpheus had created other bridges like Charlie, then they were sitting on a powder keg of consciousness transfers no one had consented to. What had Mason done in the shadows? What remnants of lost people lived, unnoticed, in animals scattered across the world? Charlie shifted, letting out a soft chirp in his sleep. Scott watched him with a strange mix of awe and sorrow. Who are you, really, old friend? And who are you still becoming? Their joint custody of Charlie had opened something new between Emily and Grace. What started as tentative cooperation had grown into something resembling a fragile friendship. They met once a week for updates. Sometimes they even shared dinner. Tonight, they sat on Emily's couch, Charlie curled between them. Grace held a wine glass, staring at the flickering candle on the table. I've been thinking about that. Journal entry. About how Francis thought Charlie was a bridge. Emily nodded. It's poetic, but terrifying too. Grace leaned back. Do you think it was ever really about the science for Francis? Or was it about immortality? Emily took a long breath. Maybe both. Maybe the science was just a path to avoid loss. Grace looked at her. You loved him once, didn't you? Emily's eyes widened, then softened. Yes, we were young, before he went underground, before Mason. I always suspected, Grace whispered. There was no anger in her voice. Just history, unfolded. Charlie stretched, resting his head on Emily's thigh, tail flicking toward Grace's side. He loved. You too, Emily said. He just loved science more. Grace smiled, but there was pain behind it. I think Charlie knew, she said softly. Julian hunched over the monitor, eyes bloodshot, fingers flying across the keyboard. The data compiled slowly. Neural scans, emotional triggers, heat mapping, audio stimuli, all compressed into the prototype interface they were calling EchoPath. It's not a conversation, Julian warned. At best, it's a pattern response simulator, but based on Charlie's memory retention and associative learning, we might be able to trigger an encoded behavior loop that mirrors Francis's thought matrix. Scott stared at the black glass enclosure they'd set up. Charlie sat calmly inside, sensors attached to his collar, gentle lights pulsing. What does that mean in human terms? Emma asked from the side. Julian leaned back. It means the cat might talk. Emma blinked. That's either the best or worst sentence I've ever heard. They started with simple triggers. Julian played recordings from Francis's lab sessions, phrases, commands, and keywords. At first, nothing happened. Then Charlie twitched. His ears swiveled. His tail lashed. When Julian said the phrase, initiate, memory protocol, Charlie sat up, eyes focused and meowed, sharp, insistent, and rhythmic. The AI interface began mapping pitch and cadence. Julian ran it through the behavior response loop. A voice, digitally reconstructed, played back through. The speaker, it was unmistakably Francis. Is the vessel stable? Memory thresholds appear intact, proceeding with integrated layering. Scott's breath caught. Again, he said. More sequences followed. Each one a phrase, a whisper from the past, drawn out by specific stimuli. It wasn't communication in real time. It was like listening to a mind caught in amber, repeating thoughts that had once been alive. Then, something broke the loop. Charlie looked directly at Scott, growled low, then meowed 3 sharp syllables that weren't part of any prior sequence. The translator struggled. Scott. No. Safe. The room went silent. Emma whispered. That wasn't playback. Julian paled. That was response. Charlie lowered his head, but his eyes didn't break contact. Scott leaned in, stunned. You know me? Charlie blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Yes. Inside a subterranean chamber on the outskirts of Washington, Dr. Victoria Ung stood before a bank of cryo-storage pods. Each one housed an animal, mostly cats, some dogs, 2 primates. Sedated, tagged, all subjects in the Orpheus program. We begin reintegration trials within the week, Eng said to her assistant. Charlie was our first uncontrolled success. But now we'll prove we can extract everything. Her assistant tapped a tablet. And the veterinarian? Ng's lips thinned. Rowan is watching him. If he tries to replicate the system outside, our network... She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she turned to Pod 6. A gray cat lay inside. Tag read, Athena. Subject 42B, Harrington Clone Protocol. Smiled coldly. Let's wake her up. Late that night, Scott sat alone in the lab. The others had gone home, but he couldn't leave. He kept replaying that moment. Scott. No. Safe. Francis, or what was left of him, was warning him. But from what? Scott. Scrolled back through the encrypted folder from the flash drive. One file had never opened. Until now. It auto-decrypted as soon as the new AI system processed its behavioral triggers. The screen filled with documents, contracts, purchase orders, and one massive data log titled Convergence Phase 1. Inside, names appeared: Emily Harrington, Francis Carter, Grace Mason, even his own. Scott stared at it. They had all been part of the experiment. Not just Charlie. They were the experiment. The next morning, Scott met Emily and Grace at the clinic. We need to talk, he said. He told them everything. The integration protocols, the hidden file, the names. I think Francis used us all as behavioral anchors, he said. Memory weights. Charlie wasn't just storing his mind. He was distributing it. Across us. Emily's face paled. You mean, we carry parts of him? Yes, that's why Charlie bonded to both of you. Why he reacted to me. Francis needed people he trusted, people he loved. Each of us carries a fragment. Emotional echoes. He built a living network, Grace whispered. And now, Scott looked down at Charlie, who sat calmly on the exam table. I think he's trying to make sure we don't lose what's left of him. Or maybe, what's left of us. Agent Rowan leaned against his black SUV, watching the clinic. He tapped. His earpiece. They found the hidden file. Yes, he's figured it out. A voice crackled back. Good. Time to bring them in. Rowan opened the trunk. Inside, 3 black boxes marked with biohazard tags. He smiled grimly. Let's see how many bridges we can burn. That night, Charlie dreamed. He stood in a field of light, grass shifting beneath his paws. Ahead stood Francis, not quite human, not quite ghost. They stared at each other for a long moment. Francis knelt. You did better than I ever could, he said. You kept them safe. Charlie walked forward, rubbed his head against the memory of his old friend. Francis whispered, It's time. Charlie looked back toward the edge of the dream, toward the waking world. 2 women stood there, Emily and Grace. Behind them, Scott, all 3 waiting, and Charlie, the bridge between them, stepped forward. The rain was no longer falling in droplets. It hammered the rooftops, casting a veil of noise over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Inside the clinic, the lights flickered once, then held steady. Scott stood at the window, his reflection warped against the glass. Charlie sat on the counter beside him, tail curling lazily, but his eyes were sharp, watching the storm as though expecting something to emerge from it. Emma entered, arms full of files. 2 emergency calls tonight. 1 hit and run on a raccoon, and a barn owl with a broken wing. What are the chances? Too coincidental, Scott muttered. Too much tonight is. Emma paused. You're thinking about the file again, aren't you? Convergence, Phase 1. Scott nodded. It wasn't just a project. It was a blueprint for embedding identity into living vessels, a distributed consciousness, and we were all part of it. Emma placed the files on the counter. So what do we do now? We protect him. Scott looked down at Charlie, and we find out what Phase 2 is before they start it. At her small apartment downtown, Emily Harrington sat by the fireplace with a thick envelope on her lap. It had been mailed anonymously, no return address but postmarked from Alexandria. Inside was a single sheet of ivory paper and a flash drive. The letter read, Emily, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But my work isn't. You and Grace, you're the only ones who understood the why behind Orpheus. Protect Charlie. He's more than a memory. He's a mirror. And in mirrors, we see truth. FC. Hands trembling, Emily inserted the flash drive into her laptop. The folder inside was titled Echo 2. Inside were recordings, video files, and what appeared to be blueprints for a machine. One that looked eerily like the prototype Julian had developed at the lab, but more advanced, sleeker, portable, and then there was a list. Names, coordinates, dates. Emily scrolled until one name jumped out. Dr. Victoria Ung, Convergence Phase Lead, Site 13. Her blood ran cold. They're still building this, still continuing the work. She grabbed her phone. We need to meet, she texted Scott. Now. Dr. Victoria Ung stood in the observation chamber above Lab Delta, hands behind her back. The animal, Subject 42B, Athena, lay sedated in the glass enclosure below, her vitals stable. A holographic projection hovered in front of Victoria, displaying overlapping waveforms, consciousness patterns extracted from different points in time, memories, personalities, synaptic fingerprints, all meshed into a shifting kaleidoscope of thought. Integration is at 73%, her assistant reported, higher than expected. Excellent, Victoria murmured. Prepare the conduit interface. The assistant hesitated. Ma'am, we haven't tested it on a human proxy yet. If the transfer jumps, it won't, she said curtly. Francis proved the bridge works. We're merely replicating his process, with more control. Behind her, a second screen lit up. Surveillance footage from the veterinary clinic. Scott, Emma, and Charlie. Victoria's gaze narrowed. Time to bring them in. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Scott sat with Emily and Grace in the back office, a whiteboard covered in hastily scrawled diagrams. So this Athena, Scott said, circling the name, was part of Orpheus. She was the second successful host, Emily said. Francis tried first with Charlie. Athena was supposed to be a backup, but she disappeared from records 6 years ago. I assumed she'd died. Grace rubbed her temples. She didn't. They kept her. Emma pointed to the screen. And now she's waking up. They all turned as the security monitor blinked. A dark SUV had pulled up outside the clinic. Scott stood slowly. No appointments this late. Stay here. He stepped outside into the rain. The man from the SUV approached, Agent Rowan. I told you to stop digging, Rowan said. And you ignored your conscience, Scott shot back. Rowan didn't flinch. There's a larger operation at stake. Project Orpheus was never shut down. The military wants results. So you'll risk minds, memories, souls. Rowan's face tightened. You don't understand what's coming. Project Convergence will change everything. You're either with us or against us. Scott stepped forward. I'm with Charlie. That's when Rowan's eyes flicked past him. The door to the clinic opened. Charlie padded out, calm, poised. He looked straight at Rowan, then let out a single deliberate hiss. Behind that sound, there was something else. Recognition. Rowan backed away. I see. You remember me. Later that night, Scott sat in the lab with Julian. They'd run a new scan on Charlie using the latest neural translator. A stream of sounds, images, and emotional data flowed across the interface. He's remembering more, Julian said. Not just fragments, conversations, faces. Can you isolate them? I can try. One clip stood out. Francis's voice, muffled but clear. Rowan is a danger. If he gets access to Athena, he'll initiate Phase 2 without safeguards. Another voice followed. Victoria Engs. We don't need Francis anymore. Charlie holds the baseline. Let him believe he's a pet. Scott clenched his jaw. They used him. Like a vessel. Julian nodded. They used everyone. Emma leaned against the lab door, holding her tablet. I just got an alert, she said. The drive Emily gave us? It tried to connect to an external server. Someone's watching us. Scott looked up. Can you trace it? I did more than that. She handed him the tablet. I hacked back. On the screen was a login prompt. Password already cracked. Files began downloading. Footage, lab reports, patient logs, and then a video file. Scott clicked play. Francis appeared, tired, unshaven, older than they remembered. He stared into the camera, haunted. If this reaches you, it means I failed. Charlie wasn't just an experiment. He was a safeguard, a container for the memories I couldn't trust others with. If they activate Athena, the personalities stored in her, mine included, will collapse. She wasn't stable. Only Charlie was. You must stop them. Not for me, for everyone. The video ended. Silence followed. Then Charlie meowed. The translator pulsed. One word emerged. Run. It happened fast. A black van screeched to a halt outside the clinic. Masked operatives poured out, moving with military precision. Scott grabbed Charlie, shouted for Emma and Julian to run. Emily and Grace already had a head start, fleeing through the rear exit. A smoke grenade shattered through the window, releasing a wave of choking fog. Inside the cloud, a tranquilizer dart flew past Scott's head. He ducked behind the reception desk, heart pounding. Go! Go! He yelled. Emma helped Julian into her car, peeling out of the parking lot just as the first operatives entered the building. Scott, clutching Charlie, slipped through the crawlspace beneath the clinic, emerging in the alley behind. He ran. Behind him, the clinic erupted in chaos. They regrouped at Emily's apartment. Grace, Emma, Julian, and Scott, soaked, bruised, but alive. Charlie lay on a blanket, breathing steadily. Scott paced. They wanted him. Not us. Not the files. Him. Grace sat quietly. Then we give them something else to chase. Everyone looked at her. Bait, she explained. We plant false data. Let them believe Charlie was moved, while we figure out how to shut this down. Julian hesitated. I know someone. An engineer who worked under Victoria years ago. She disappeared after Orpheus was classified. I think she might have been a whistleblower. Where? Scott asked. Julian met his eyes. Montana. The road was long and winding. Snow clung to the trees as their SUV climbed into the mountains. Charlie rested on Emma's lap, his gaze distant. Scott drove, hands tight on the wheel. Julian explained between turns. Her name's Talia Shen. She helped develop the consciousness mapping interface before Victoria took it over. She warned the ethics board. They silenced her. "And you're sure she'll help?" Emily asked. "She's the only one who might know how to reverse a transfer." Grace looked out the window. "We're not reversing anything. We're saving a soul." Charlie let out a low purr. It sounded almost like agreement. The cabin was hidden deep in the forest, surrounded by snow and pines. Talia opened the door with a rifle in her hands and suspicion in her eyes. "I told you never to come here," she snapped at Julian. "We need your help." She hesitated. Then her eyes fell on Charlie. She blinked. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's him." Scott stepped forward. "You know Charlie?" She nodded slowly. "I helped encode him 6 years ago, before I walked away." She opened the door wider. "Come in. You're not safe out here." Inside the cabin, Talia explained everything. They wanted a backup. Not for Francis, for Project Prometheus, the human transfer prototype. If they could store consciousness in animals, they believed they could do the same with people. Soldiers. Scientists. Presidents. Emma shook her head. "But it's not just data. These are souls." Talia nodded. "And you can't compress a soul. Not without losing something." She knelt beside Charlie. "You remember me, don't you?" Charlie reached out, placing one paw gently on her knee. Talia smiled sadly. "You were always the best of him." Tiketiun leaned forward. "Can we stop it?" Talia's expression turned grim. "Maybe, but only if we reach the convergence site before Athena fully awakens." Grace asked, "Where is it?" Talia stood. "I'll show you." The hidden facility was buried beneath a decommissioned radar station in northern Idaho, marked on Talia's old map only by a code, Astra 7. It had once belonged to a Cold War research unit, repurposed decades later for deep memory preservation, trials. Now, it served as the core of the convergence operation. Talia traced her finger along a topographic map spread across the cabin table. It's heavily guarded, underground with satellite cloaking, but there's a maintenance tunnel here. She tapped a spot near a cluster of pines. "Long sealed, but if we breach it, we bypass surface patrols and land directly near the lab." Scott nodded. "Then we go in through the tunnel." Grace leaned forward. "What exactly are we stopping?" Talia inhaled deeply. "Athena is waking. They plan to overwrite her remaining host body with the full dataset from Prometheus. That's more than just memory. It includes partial consciousness, from dozens of contributors. Francis, for one, but also military strategists, behavioral analysts, all mapped and cross-referenced through neural scaffolds. Julian exhaled. "An engineered identity, built from fragments." "And forced into a biological form," Talia added. "But it won't hold. Nothing stable can emerge from so many voices competing for dominance." Scott frowned. "Unless they have a stabilizer. A template." Talia looked at him, expression grim. "Exactly. That's where Charlie comes in." The sun hadn't yet risen when they began the hike. The snow had crusted over in the night, the air so cold their breath fogged and clung to their lashes. Charlie traveled inside Scott's insulated carrier, snug, quiet, observant. Julian and Emma carried portable signal dampeners to disrupt detection fields. Grace had brought the old photograph, the one with Charlie between her and Francis, as a kind of talisman. Emily had the original drive from Francis, secured in a waterproof case. It took them nearly 4 hours to reach the outer perimeter. There, behind a thicket of frozen shrubs, they found the rusted panel of the old maintenance tunnel. Talia knelt before it, inserting a thin pry rod into the frozen seal. "Help me." Scott joined her. Together they forced the hatch open with a low groan of metal. A rush of stale, cold air greeted them. "We're in," Talia said. They descended. The air inside the tunnel was metallic and thick with the scent of decay. Abandoned for decades, but still alive with the hum of hidden machinery. Rusted support beams held crumbling walls, but the deeper they went, the more modern the infrastructure became. At some point, the old tunnel had been retrofitted, seamlessly, surgically, with precise welds and fiber optic lines. Someone invested. A lot here, Emma whispered. They always do when they want to bury something, Julian replied. They reached a sealed door with biometric locks. Talia stepped forward, producing a capsule. Eye gel, she said. Synthetic retina, based on my old clearance. She applied it, stepped up to the scanner and leaned in. A flicker. A pause. Then, access granted. The door hissed open. Beyond it, light poured into the corridor. Smooth metal walls, motion sensors, surveillance cameras, all dark. They must think no one would ever come this way, Talia murmured. They moved forward. They found the main lab at the heart of the complex. A wide, circular chamber surrounded by glass consoles and digital panels. In the center, floating inside a cylindrical tank filled with clear fluid, was Athena. She was young, early 20s in appearance, but her body bore evidence of multiple surgeries, implants, neural ports. Her eyes were closed, her face eerily serene. Above her, suspended by a mechanical arm, hovered the final piece, the Prometheus array, a sleek, coffin-like device lined with neural data drives. They're preparing to upload, Talia said, but they haven't started yet. Scott placed Charlie gently on the console. Can we intercept it? He asked. Talia looked to Julian. He studied the interface. Maybe. If I plug in the drive Emily brought, I can loop the signal and redirect the primary transfer into a blank shell. Will that damage her? Grace asked. No, Talia replied. It'll just prevent the overwrite. Emma looked at Charlie. And what about him? We'll keep him out of the stream, Julian assured, unless they trigger the stabilization protocol. Then he'll be drawn in whether we like it or not. Emily stepped forward. Then we stay close. We protect him. But before they could act, the door opened. Dr. Victoria Eng entered slowly, her eyes fixed on Charlie. I wondered when you'd come. Scott moved in front of the cat. This ends now, she raised a hand. I'm not here to stop you. I'm here to finish what Francis began. Julian scoffed. He tried to stop you. No, she said calmly. He feared misuse. He didn't fear the science. You never understood that. She stepped toward the tank, regarding Athena's still form. This isn't about control. It's about continuity. Human memory is fragile, fallible. But identity, true identity, is architecture. Francis encoded the best parts of himself in Charlie. That was never a cage. It was a blueprint. I intend to restore it. Scott narrowed his eyes. At what cost? None, Victoria said, unless you interfere. Talia approached, voice sharp. You can't force Athena to hold all that data. She'll fragment. Victoria turned to her. Not if we give her a template, a foundation to build upon. Charlie isn't just a cat. He's a guide, Charlie hissed. Victoria's expression softened. Francis, is that you? And then Charlie spoke, not in words, but through the translator. One voice, rich and deep, processed by the device. You never listened. I begged you to stop. Victoria froze. Julian blinked. It's him. Full vocal synthesis. Scott stepped forward. He remembers. Victoria's eyes welled with tears. Francis, then you know why I have to finish this. For the future. No, Charlie's voice replied. For your legacy. Then the alarms sounded. Flashing red lights filled the chamber. A robotic voice announced, Unauthorized transfer attempt detected. Initiating lockdown. Victoria turned to the console. Someone else is accessing the system. They're overriding us. Julian pulled his tablet from his bag. It's an external. Command, military uplink. They've hijacked the Prometheus core. Talia's face darkened. It's Rowan. He doesn't want a conscious Athena. He wants a programmable one. Charlie jumped from the console, tail high, ears forward. He ran toward the primary interface and sat before the neural link port. Scott shouted, "No! He'll be pulled in!" But it was too late. The Prometheus array opened. Energy surged. Charlie's body convulsed, and the room exploded into light. When the light faded, everything had changed. Charlie's body lay still, his chest rising slowly. Athena stood upright inside the tank, eyes open, face calm, expression unreadable. Victoria stepped forward. "Athena." The woman turned to her. "Yes and no." Scott moved closer. "Do you know who you are?" She turned to him, tilting her head. "I am Athena. I am fragments of others. But one voice speaks clearest now." She pointed to Charlie. "Francis." Emma's voice trembled. Are you both?" Athena nodded. "He bridged the gap, used his own thread to anchor me. Without him, I would have shattered." Victoria gasped. "You merged." "Not merged," Athena replied. "Balanced," Julian whispered. "Then the transfer worked?" "No," Athena said. "It transcended." Charlie stirred, lifting his head. He looked diminished, his fur duller, his eyes slower. Scott picked him up, heart aching. "What did he give?" Athena answered. "Everything's stable. Everything's still good. His essence is here." She tapped her temple. "But the body remains." Talia looked at the console. "His neural signature is reduced. Not erased, but faint." "He sacrificed cohesion," Athena said, "to keep me whole." Emily knelt by Charlie, holding his paw. "Can we get him back?" Athena placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "He's not gone. He's with me, and with you. Just quieter now." Grace stepped forward. "Then we protect both of you." Victoria looked between them. "You don't understand. He was the key to all of this. If he's unstable—" Scott silenced her with a glance. "He's not unstable. He's at peace." Suddenly, the console sparked. Julian rushed over. "They're initiating a wipe." "What?" Talia cried. "They've overridden all clearance. The facility's shutting down. Total purge." Athena reached toward the tank, placing her hand against the glass. "I can't stop it," she whispered. "It's too late." Alarms rang again. Emergency lights pulsed. Victoria shouted, "There's a secondary exit. Come!" They ran, carrying Charlie, the drive, and whatever they could grab. The hallway behind them buckled as explosions echoed through the walls. They reached a narrow tunnel, a forgotten maintenance shaft. Climbing. Running. As they emerged into the snowy dusk, the earth beneath them shook. Behind them, the mountain swallowed the lab in smoke. Project Convergence was gone. 3 days later, in a rented house near Flathead Lake, they regrouped. Charlie slept often now, curled in a warm bed by the fire. Athena sat at the window, watching the snow. Scott approached her. "How are you?" She didn't answer for a moment. "Sometimes I remember walking through parks with Emily, or watching Grace cry on the kitchen floor, or the feel of a scalpel in my hand. Sometimes I am Francis. Other times I am someone else, but I am learning." Scott nodded. "You're not alone." Athena turned. "And Charlie?" "He's quieter, but still there." She smiled faintly. "Then we both have ghosts." Grace sat on the porch with a notebook in her lap. She wrote slowly, deliberately. "Francis, you're still with us. I see you in Charlie's eyes when the sun hits them just right. I hear you in Athena's voice when she says something only you would know. We weren't perfect, but you gave us the best of yourself. And now we'll give the best of ourselves to protect what remains." She folded the letter and tucked it into Charlie's old collar. Talia returned to her cabin, promising to monitor for any remaining traces of convergence tech. Julian and Emma planned to co-author a paper on the ethics of consciousness mapping, coded, indirect, and fiercely debated before publication. Emily decided to stay with Athena for a while, helping her navigate the strange tapestry of memories she carried. Grace adopted another cat, an orange tabby named Leo. Charlie watched him with mild disinterest, but occasionally batted at him in lazy companionship. Scott remained at the clinic. Every few days he sat with Charlie and told him stories, some from his life, others from Francis's journals. Sometimes Charlie blinked slowly. Sometimes he purred. A year passed. Athena, now going by the name Mira, had integrated into a quiet life. She painted, taught part-time at a community college, and walked often with Emily. One afternoon, she returned to the clinic. Charlie was curled in a sunbeam, breathing gently. She knelt beside him. "Hello, Francis," she whispered. Charlie opened one eye. She reached out. He placed his paw on her hand, and in that moment, no machines, no translators, she felt him. Whole. Still there. Still watching. In the end, it wasn't technology that saved them. It was memory. It was love. It was the unshakable belief that even in fragments, something whole could be made. Charlie had never been just a cat. He had been a mirror, a bridge, a soul given a second chance to find its way back home. It had been 15 months since the collapse of Astra 7, since the ground swallowed the secrets of convergence and left behind only silence and memory. In that time, the world had moved on, mostly unaware that a battle for identity, memory, and control had been fought and won in the shadows. Mira lived in the outskirts of Kalispell now, a modest mountain town far removed from the echoes of war or conspiracy. She went by Mira Athene, for simplicity, for peace, for protection. Her hair had grown longer, framing a face that still bore Francis's expressions when she was tired, or thoughtful, or teasing. She had come to accept it. The reality of being. Someone new, born from many, cradled by one. She lived in a small cabin near the river. Her days were filled with small things: gardening, sketching, reading. And on Wednesdays she painted at the community center, sharing silence and color with a group of older women who never asked why her hands trembled when she painted faces. Charlie still visited. Scott brought him every other weekend, though aged now, gray-flecked, slower, no longer leaping from counters. Charlie retained that spark. He'd sit in the sunniest window of her home, watching birds, sometimes meowing with that familiar, almost human disapproval. Mira never asked him questions anymore. She didn't need to. In his silence, she found enough. It was a Thursday afternoon when the knock came. Mira paused, brush still in hand, canvas half finished. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. A storm was coming. Thick gray clouds rolled in from the north like waves about to break. The knock came again. 3 taps. Deliberate, not urgent, but measured. She wiped her hands, crossed the small living room, and opened the door. Talia stood there, older, leaner, eyes sharper than Mira remembered. She wore a dark coat and a scarf, her hands bare despite the chill. "Talia," Mira said, blinking. "I need your help," Talia replied, stepping in. They sat by the fireplace, tea between them. Talia wasted no time. "You remember the lab in Oregon? The secondary testing facility Francis used before Astra 7? Mira frowned. "Yes, it wasn't operational, just archival." "It is now," Talia said. "Someone's reactivated it, and they're extracting data from the partial Prometheus backup stored there." Mira went still. "How?" Encrypted overlays. I left a blind key in the Oregon matrix after convergence fell. It shouldn't have been possible to decrypt it without Francis's biometric pairings. Mira looked down at her hands. Talia nodded slowly. Unless they found a workaround, or a duplicate. The air between them thickened. I traced the digital signature, Talia continued. It's not government, not corporate, it's private. A shell group, a Turnham consortium. Mira's chest tightened. I've never heard of them. You wouldn't have. They specialize in post-mortem memory extractions. Not just data. Consciousness fragments, Mira whispered. They want to rebuild Prometheus. Talia nodded once. Or something worse. That evening, Mira made 2 phone calls. The first was to Scott. She didn't have to explain much. We need Charlie, I figured, he said. He's already by the door. The second was to Emily. There was silence on the line for a long moment after Mira explained. I thought we were done, Emily said finally. I thought we'd won. We did, Mira replied, but they're trying to rewrite the victory. Oh, pack my things. They met in the Bitterroot Valley. Julian and Emma had set up a temporary safe house, a log cabin in the trees with EMP shielding and a low thermal signature. They'd upgraded since the old days. Julian had grown a beard. Emma now carried a sidearm openly. When they saw Mira, Emma embraced her. You look stronger, she said. I feel more centered. Charlie prowled around the room, sniffing everything, his movements slower, more deliberate. When he saw Julian, he meowed once, a sound full of recognition and dry amusement. He remembers, Julian said. Always, Emily replied. They gathered around a digital map. Talia tapped a glowing red point. This is the Oregon facility. It's codenamed Oubliette, French for forgotten place. Built into an abandoned mine. On paper, it's decommissioned. No power, no staffing. But last week, this happened. She played a satellite feed. A convoy, 3 black SUVs, pulled up to the overgrown road leading to the mine. A group of suited figures exited. Armed. Coordinated. We ran facial recognition. No matches. They're ghosts. Mercenaries, Julian said. Or worse, Emma added. Mira frowned. Then what do we do? Talia looked around the room. Go back. They arrived in Oregon under cover of a rainstorm. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, the path to the old mine half consumed by moss and undergrowth. They came in 2 vehicles. Mira, Charlie, Talia, and Emily in one. Julian, Emma, and Scott in the other. They parked a mile out and hiked the rest. The mine entrance had been refortified, steel plating and sensor clusters hidden in natural stone, but Julian had anticipated it. He held up a signal jammer. We've got 15 minutes before they know we're here. Emma placed a small explosive charge on the new door. A thump. A crack. They entered. The air inside was moist, filled with echoes. The walls, once carved by miners, had been overlaid with synthetic resin and mesh. Modern infrastructure hidden beneath the illusion of abandonment. They moved carefully, Charlie staying close to Mira's feet. Third corridor on the left, Talia whispered. That leads to the original archive room. Emma scouted ahead. Clear. They advanced, but as they reached the intersection, a shape emerged from the shadows. Not a soldier. A boy. 16, maybe 17. Pale, with copper hair and wide eyes. He held a tablet. His hands trembled. Please, he said. I'm not with them. I was just trying to see if it was real. Julian raised his weapon. Who are you? Elias, the boy, said. I'm the son of Dr. Ung. They bound his wrists gently and brought him to the central chamber. Elias stared at Mira like she was a ghost. You're her, he whispered. Athena. Mira sighed. Not exactly. She used to talk about you. She had files, drawings, plans for your future. Talia paced. Why are you here? Elias swallowed. She died 6 months ago. But before that, she made me promise to come here, to find the rest of the data. What for? Emily asked. I don't know. She said, it was my legacy, too. Emma muttered, damn. Julian checked the central console. He's not lying. He tried accessing the mainframe. He tripped the failsafes. Talia stepped toward Elias. You understand what's in that data? What it can do? He looked away. I just wanted to know who she really was. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Emma cursed. We've got company. Talia pulled up the live feed on Julian's tablet. 4 incoming, armed, moving fast. Julian handed Mira a tablet. Back up the partials, get what you can. Emma tossed Elias a small flashlight. You're with me. Stay low. Gunfire echoed in the distance. Mira worked quickly. Charlie perched on the console, tail twitching. Talia stood guard at the doorway. They're coming through the ventilation shaft, she said. Julian planted a secondary charge. We collapse the main corridor after we're out. No loose ends. Mira found it. A corrupted file labeled Echo, F, Carter, primary scaffold. V3.7. It pulsed faintly. Alive. She hesitated, then she downloaded it. They fought their way out. Emma and Julian taking point, returning fire as the rest of the group slipped through a maintenance tunnel. The data drive was secured. Charlie remained close to Mira, never flinching. When they emerged into the trees, the storm had thickened, rain soaking. Their clothes, blood mixing with mud. Elias limped, a graze on his leg. Julian sealed the tunnel behind them with a remote trigger. A boom. Earth shook. Birds fled the canopy. They didn't stop running until they reached the vehicles. Back at the safe house, Mira sat in the dark. The drive glowed faintly. In her palm, she knew what it held. A deeper scaffold of Francis. One never transferred into Charlie. One buried beneath a layer of protective code. A legacy. Scott entered quietly. You're thinking about loading it, she nodded. Will you? I don't know, she said. Part of me thinks it should be erased. He knelt beside her. Sometimes the truth can be carried, not erased, not hidden, just understood. She looked to Charlie. He was asleep. Peaceful. But if I load this, she whispered, what happens to the version of him I already carry? Scott placed a hand over hers. Maybe you become more. Not less. They set up a sterile interface. In the cabin, Julian adjusted the parameters. We can isolate it. No merge, just view access. Emma watched the readings. It's stable. Surprisingly, Talia monitored the bandwidth. Encrypted memories like this are fragile. Treat them gently. Mira nodded. She closed her eyes and activated the file. It wasn't like before. There was no overwhelming rush, no collapse into chaos. This time she found herself standing in a white corridor lined with doors. She walked forward, slowly, listening. Each door opened with a whisper of memory. Francis, as a boy, building radios with his father. Francis at university, arguing about the ethics of neural mapping. Francis in the lab, holding Charlie as a kitten. You'll help me remember who I am. Mira stopped before a final door. She opened it. Francis sat at a table, older than she remembered him, wearing the same sweater he'd once worn in the photo on Grace's mantel. He looked up and smiled. So, he said, you found me. They sat together, no urgency, no clock. Why did you lock this part away? Mira asked. Francis looked at his hands. Because it wasn't meant for the world. Just for the one who came after. You made me, she said. I made part of you, he corrected. The rest, you became. She looked at him. I'm afraid. I know, he said gently. But you've already done the hardest thing. You survived becoming. She reached out. He took her hand. In you, he said, I am not gone. But neither am I required. You are more than what I left. When Mira opened her eyes, it was morning. The cabin was quiet. The others still slept. Charlie was on her chest, purring softly. She stroked his fur. You were right, she said. He's still here. But so are we. Outside, the storm had passed, and the world felt new again. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the city, its rays piercing through the remnants of the night's darkness. Elena stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky met the sea. The events of the previous days had left her restless, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She turned away from the window, her reflection in the mirror catching her attention. The woman staring back at her bore the marks of sleepless nights and unspoken fears. Yet, beneath the weariness, there was a glint of determination, a resolve to uncover the truths that had long been buried. Downstairs, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. Elena descended the staircase, each step echoing in the silence of the house. In the kitchen, Alex sat at the table, a newspaper spread out before him. He looked up as she entered, offering a faint smile. Morning, he greeted, his voice tinged with fatigue. Morning, Elena replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She took a seat across from him, the warmth of the mug seeping into her hands. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds being the rustle of the newspaper and the distant chirping of birds. Finally, Elena spoke. I've been thinking about what we discovered, she began, her eyes meeting Alex's. About the documents, the hidden files. There's more to this than we initially thought. Alex nodded, folding the newspaper. I agree. The pieces don't fit together neatly. There's a larger puzzle here, and we're only seeing fragments. Elena took a sip of her coffee, the bitterness grounding her thoughts. We need to dig deeper. There are people who know more, people who might be willing to talk. Alex leaned back, in his chair, contemplating her words. Do you have someone in mind? She hesitated, then nodded. There's an old contact of mine, someone who used to work in the archives. If anyone can help us navigate this, it's him. Later that day, Elena and Alex found themselves in a dimly lit cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The scent of aged books and freshly ground coffee beans filled the air. At a corner table sat an elderly man, his silver hair neatly combed, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. Elena, he greeted warmly as they approached. It's been years. Too many. Victor, she replied, embracing him briefly. This is Alex, my colleague. Victor extended a hand, which Alex shook firmly. Pleasure to meet you. They sat down, and after ordering their drinks, Elena leaned in. Victor, we need your help. We've come across some documents, classified files that suggest a cover-up. We believe there's more beneath the surface. Victor's expression grew serious. What kind of documents? Elena produced a folder from her bag, sliding it across the table. Victor opened it, scanning the contents. His brows furrowed as he read, the lines on his face deepening. This is significant, he murmured. These files reference operations that were supposed to be sealed indefinitely. If these have surfaced, it means someone wants them found, or wants to send a message. Alex leaned forward. Do you recognize any of the names or locations mentioned? Victor nodded slowly. Some. This one, he pointed to a name, was a high-ranking official in the intelligence agency. Disappeared under mysterious circumstances. And this location, he tapped a line of text, was a covert facility, decommissioned years ago. Elena exchanged a glance with Alex. "We need to know what happened there. Can you help us access more information?" Victor hesitated, then sighed. "I can try, but be cautious. Delving into these matters can be dangerous. There are those who would prefer the past remain buried." Over the next few days, Victor provided them with leads, names of former operatives, locations of hidden archives, and whispers of clandestine meetings. Elena and Alex followed each trail meticulously, piecing together a narrative that painted a grim picture of corruption, betrayal, and silenced truths. Their journey took them to abandoned buildings, where faded documents lay forgotten, to remote villages, where aging residents recounted tales of disappearances and fear, and to bustling cities, where secrets lurked behind polished facades. Each revelation brought them closer to understanding the magnitude of the conspiracy. They discovered that the operations mentioned in the files were part of a larger scheme. One that involved illegal experiments, unauthorized surveillance, and the manipulation of public perception. The deeper they dug, the more perilous their quest became. They were followed, their communications monitored, and subtle threats began to emerge. But their resolve remained unshaken. One evening, as they reviewed their findings in a secluded motel room, Elena turned to Alex. "We've uncovered enough to expose them, but we need to be strategic. If we release this information recklessly, it could endanger lives." Alex nodded. "Agreed. We need allies, journalists, activists, anyone who can help us disseminate the truth. Responsibly, they compiled their evidence into a comprehensive dossier, encrypting the files and distributing copies to trusted contacts. They reached out to investigative reporters, human rights organizations, and legal experts, ensuring that the information would not be easily suppressed. As the story broke, it sent shockwaves through the nation. Protests erupted, demanding accountability. Investigations were launched, and those implicated faced scrutiny. The veil of secrecy had been lifted, revealing the rot that had festered beneath. Elena and Alex watched the events unfold from a distance, their identities concealed to protect themselves and those they cared about. Though they had succeeded in their mission, they knew the battle for justice was far from over. In the quiet moments, Elena reflected on the journey, the risks taken, the truths uncovered, and the resilience of those who dared to challenge the status quo. She understood that while the shadows of the past could never be entirely erased, shining a light upon them was the first step toward healing and change. The other cat blinked slowly, its eyes like emerald glass. Still. Too still. Grace backed, away instinctively, clutching the real Charlie to her chest. Scott crouched, examining the second feline as it slowly lifted its head. The movement was precise, too fluid, engineered, controlled. Emma's scanner beeped. "This one's collar's been embedded, internally. No tag, but the signal's active. Same chipset as Charlie's, only newer, upgraded." "Clone?" Grace asked, breathless. "Maybe not a clone," Scott said. "A countermeasure. A mirrored vessel, built off Charlie's behavioral template but given a different purpose." He turned to Emma. "We need Julian." Julian arrived at the clinic within the hour. His hair was disheveled, eyes bloodshot, clothes wrinkled from travel. He hadn't been sleeping. Not since the Oregon extraction and the Eternum Consortium's attempted reboot of Prometheus. Scott had briefed him over the phone, but nothing could prepare him for seeing the new cat in person. "You weren't exaggerating," Julian muttered, running a hand over his stubble. "That's not a clone. It's a divergence unit, an anti-anchor." "Explain," Emma said. Julian pulled up a holographic rendering of the original Charlie's neural imprint. Every Mason subject was built around a concept: empathy, resilience, loyalty. Charlie was the success story because he adapted his stored imprints without rejecting emotional context. But the alpha model you found, he's not adaptive. He's reactive. The design's reversed. "Reversed how?" Grace asked. He's not a memory keeper, Julian said. He's a memory wiper. A silence fell over the room. Emma broke it. You mean, like an eraser? Julian nodded grimly. Exactly. His presence triggers memory degradation in other tethered hosts. In theory, he could dissolve whatever fragments of Francis still exist. In Charlie, in Athena, maybe even in you. Grace shook her head. Why would Mason create that? To protect themselves, Scott said. To erase proof. If their vessels ever got loose, if someone like Charlie survived, they'd need a failsafe. A cleaner. Emma stared at the alpha model. So how do we stop him? Julian hesitated. We have to find his original programming node, trace the neural pathway, and shut it down before the signals destabilize Charlie or Athena. Emma's brow furrowed. And where would that be? Julian turned to Scott, eyes heavy with regret. Athena. Mira Athene's fingers trembled over the paintbrush. The canvas before her was unfinished, just a smear of warm grays and stormy blues. But she wasn't seeing paint anymore. She was seeing corridors, wireframes, the inside of a machine she thought she'd left behind. It had started the night before. A headache, sharp and blinding, like something inside her skull was shifting. Then came the visions, snippets, flashbacks, not of her life, but of someone else's. Francis, yes, but not just him, someone darker, a mirror made of thorns. She had called Emily immediately. They're using the other one, she had whispered. What other one? Emily had said, her voice tight. The one Francis warned about, Mira said. The one Mason called Echo Null. Julian patched a portable transmitter into the alpha model's neural port. The creature remained calm, unnervingly so, allowing the probes to attach without resistance. Scott watched warily. He's not feral. He's not even confused. He's optimized, Julian replied. No competing emotions, just directive-based behavior, a living execution order. Which makes him dangerous, Emma said. To Charlie, Grace asked. To everyone connected, Julian said. His monitor lit up. Strings of code flickered across the screen. Got it, he said. Transmitter sync complete. I can backtrace. His last remote activation. Wherever he was rebooted, that's where the core signal is coming from. Scott leaned in. Coordinates. Julian's face fell as the data resolved. Oh, God. Emma read the location aloud. Northern Nevada. Groom Lake, Grace gasped. You're kidding. Julian shook his head. They restarted it inside the old Dreamland grid. Area 51. The van vibrated over gravel roads as storm clouds gathered overhead. Julian sat in the passenger seat, scanning live satellite data. Scott drove with eyes fixed forward, jaw tight. The back, Charlie curled in Grace's lap, while the alpha model was sedated and secured in an EMP-insulated carrier. Emma monitored his vitals while texting Emily and Mira en route. They're ready, she announced. Mira said she's stabilized for now, but she's still feeling tremors in her memory scaffolding. She's resonating with Charlie, Scott said, even across hundreds of miles. Which means the divergence is accelerating. Julian added. Then we don't have much time, Grace said. Emily laid out Mira's original journal, pages fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window. Outside, thunder rolled. You said it's like something's bleeding through, Emily said. Mira nodded. Her eyes were glassy. Yes, like a signal hijack. They're not attacking my body. They're rewriting the story. Francis's fragments are fading. Emily clenched her fists. Then we anchor them. You and Charlie. Together. Mira looked up. How? Emily reached into a drawer and pulled out the very first collar, the original pre-Mason, the one Emily had given Charlie, as a kitten long before the experiments began. He always came back to this, Emily said. No tech, just love. We'll use it. The air around the old hangars was radioactive with secrecy. Most believed the base had been moved decades ago, but Mason had never needed the official location. They'd built their own underneath it. The group donned gray parkas and optical disruptors. Julian handed each of them signal nullifiers. "The signal dampeners will hold for 20 minutes, he warned. "After that, we're visible." Emma checked the EMP cage on the Alpha Charlie. Still asleep, for now. Grace gripped the original, collar in one hand. "Let's finish this." They entered through a drainage access hatch 3 miles from the main complex. The tunnel was narrow, lined with reinforced conduit and temperature-regulated walls. Inside, there was no sound, no hum, no alarms, just waiting. The chamber was a cathedral of metal and light. Screens shimmered with biometric readouts. In the center floated a cylinder, massive, silent, marked with the Prometheus insignia. On one screen, a neural imprint. Cascade. Alpha Charlie's waveform, pulsing like a drumbeat. On another, Athena's cognitive map, corrupting, bleeding, fragmenting. "They're in sync," Julian said. "Echo null is broadcasting. Athena's degrading." Scott stepped forward. "Then let's return the signal." He pulled Charlie from his carrier and held up the original collar, the analog one. "Let's give him back his origin." He fastened it around Charlie's neck. The effect was immediate. Charlie lifted his head. His pupils dilated. The monitors flared. Julian gasped. "He's syncing with her, counteracting the decay." The Prometheus core began to hum. Warning, a synthetic. Voice boomed. "Protocol divergence in conflict. Memory integrity breach. System instability imminent." Lights turned red. Doors sealed. From the far wall, a mechanical drone descended, scanning them all. Emma cursed. "Security AI! They're going to purge everything." Grace stepped forward and raised her hand. "I'll take the Alpha. Everyone. Turn to her. He was with me the longest. I'll carry what he was. If that buys Charlie more time, if it saves Athena, I'll do it." Julian started to object, but Charlie meowed, and Grace smiled. "I think he agrees." She picked up the sleeping Alpha Charlie and stepped into the central containment pod. Mira collapsed. Emily caught her before she hit the floor. The room filled with a sound, not quite a scream, not quite static, a kind of spiritual rupture. Then Mira opened her eyes. "She's doing it," she whispered. "Grace?" Emily asked. "She's tethering him, taking the pain so the rest can be whole." Emily held her tighter. Mira whispered, "Tell her. Thank you." The lights dimmed. The divergence waveform vanished. Charlie purred softly, eyes closed, his breathing smooth. Grace emerged from the pod carrying the Alpha Cat. Now, inert, silent. "He's gone," she whispered. "Or sleeping. Either way, we're safe." Julian checked the monitors. "Athena's scaffold is stabilizing," he confirmed. "The bleed has stopped." Scott put a hand on Charlie's back. "You saved her," he said softly. Again, Emma smiled. "And maybe you saved us, too." Emily arrived with Mira. She walked straighter now. Her hands no longer trembled. There was light in her eyes. Grace met her in the lobby, Charlie between them. The two women hugged, no need for words. Charlie rubbed against them both. Scott stepped out, watching the reunion. He turned to Julian. "Do you think we've seen the last of Mason's legacy?" Julian sighed. "Maybe. Or maybe the future depends on what we choose to remember, and what we choose to let go." Charlie leapt into Mira's lap. He purred, and everything was quiet again. The silence after the storm was the kind that doesn't ask questions. It just sits with you. It observes. It waits. In Kalispell, Mira Athene stood beneath the soft light of dawn. Charlie pressed gently to her chest. The air smelled of pine and smoke and something older, like the memory of something no longer possible. Scott, Julian, Grace, Emma, and Emily had joined her at the cabin after Groom Lake, weary but bonded. The fracture between them, between the past and the future, had held. For now, Julian had brought the inert Alpha Charlie with them, now wrapped in an insulated case with biometric shielding. Its eyes no longer opened. But Mira still felt it sometimes, as if a weight remained in the air wherever it was kept. It was built to erase, Julian had said, but it couldn't, not all of it. Charlie blinked slowly, warm and alive and full of that eerie knowing, and Mira whispered, "That's because memory isn't a file, it's a choice." The convergence event had left behind more than trauma. It left code. Emma ran diagnostics through her modified terminal, still cross-referencing the Mason remnants Julian had decrypted. Her screen buzzed with archived logs, diverged scaffolds, project tags, even emotional modeling blueprints. But it was a fragment from the Prometheus array, recovered in the Groom Lake mainframe collapse, that now drew her attention. An isolated folder labeled keylast.turg. It refused to open. No password, no biometric access. Just a prompt. "Will you remember me?" She stared at it for a long time. Then she called Scott over. He sat beside her, reading the line aloud. "That's not code," he murmured. "That's Francis." They ran the file through the EchoPath interpreter, retooling the interface to match Mira's current neural imprint. Julian administered light sedation to help regulate memory bleed. Mira lay back, electrodes connecting to her temples. Scott asked again, quietly, "Are you sure you want this?" Mira nodded. "I have to finish what he started." The file opened. Light, sound, and then Francis Carter, standing in a room not unlike the one they were in now. On a screen behind him, Charlie. Not the Charlie of today, but the young one. The prototype, sleek and bright-eyed. "If you're watching this," Francis said, "then you survived the divergence, which means you became." He smiled faintly. "I always knew you would. I never wanted to become immortal. Just remembered. And not by the world. By you. The one who bore the fragments, who held the weight of me without breaking." He paused. "But the others won't stop. Eternum will try again. With another host. Another experiment. You need to make them stop, and to do that you'll need the final key." He reached down, petting Charlie gently. "It isn't a code. It isn't even knowledge. It's empathy. Show them. Let them see what we chose not to erase." The video ended. Mira sat up, shaking, and suddenly they understood. The final key wasn't a weapon. It was Charlie. Not as tech, not as template, but as proof that something synthetic had made a human choice, that he'd held on, not to data, but to people. Julian tapped the table. "If we broadcast this across Eternum's own channels, mirror their signal beams, we could collapse the rest of their tethered systems." Emma nodded. "We'd be forcing them to feel." Grace chuckled softly. "Revolution by purring," Scott said. "Then let's make the world remember." The plan unfolded in stages. Emily used old media contacts and underground whistleblower forums to leak the video Francis left behind. Julian repurposed a Mason satellite relay to beam Charlie's neural responses through softwave, emotional spectrum frequencies, not language. Within days, animal behaviorists around the world reported synchronized emotional anomalies. Cats purring at identical frequencies, dogs howling in tandem at static triggers, horses pressing against walls as if listening. They were remembering too. And then came the call, from a blocked number. Voice masked, Eternum. You ended Phase 2. But we still hold the baseline, Scott replied calmly. You never understood the baseline. It wasn't code, it was care. The voice snapped. You can't stop us all. Mira took the phone from Scott. No, she said, but he can. Charlie meowed once, soft but deliberate. The line went dead. In the aftermath, Eternum fractured. Key founders disappeared. Leaked footage and neural broadcast interference drew the attention of international watchdog groups. Most of the surviving research was seized. Some of it burned, but Mira knew better than to believe in total erasure. So she stayed in Kalispell, with Charlie, with Grace and Emily nearby, with Emma and Julian making quarterly visits to keep the archives safe. She painted, she taught, she told stories. Sometimes, when the nights grew long and winter scraped against the windows, she would sit beside Charlie and whisper, "Remember me." And he always did. Every time. The first snow of winter dusted the rooftops of Kalispell in silence, the kind of quiet that lingered long after the world had moved on. Inside Mira's cabin, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the scent of pine and honeyed tea perfumed the air. Charlie lay curled in the windowsill, bathed in pale light, his fur now tinged with gray at the tips, age creeping in like a whisper. Mira sat at the table, a journal open before her. Every morning, she wrote. Not for posterity, not for science, but for the ones who might someday wonder what became of Charlie, of Francis, of the people who had carried their memories across fire. Scott visited often now, not as a vet, not even as a scientist, just as a man who knew what it meant to witness something impossible and be changed by it. Today, he brought an envelope. From Geneva, he said, placing it on the table. International Bioethics Consortium. They're requesting a full case study on Project Orpheus. Mira didn't look up. She traced the pen across the page. Do they want the truth, or just something that can be cited in a report? Both, Scott admitted. But more people are starting to believe what we saw. What he was. Mira turned the page. He still is. Charlie flicked his tail, as if in agreement. Grace ran a small sanctuary now. Tucked between the trees at the edge of town, the facility served as a recovery home for displaced animals and experimental rescues. She called it the Bridge. Named, of course, for Charlie. She and Emily co-managed it. What had once been a grief-forged rivalry had evolved into a sisterhood of purpose. Together, they had learned to carry not just Francis's memory, but the truth he had tried to preserve. That love, like memory, could survive even the cruelest science. Emily stood outside the sanctuary that morning, her breath misting in the cold. A young boy, maybe 8, approached with a battered carrier. Inside was a calico with matted fur and wide, frightened eyes. She followed me home, the boy said. I think she remembers me from before. Emily smiled. Sometimes memory finds its way back. She opened the gate. Let's find out. Julian and Emma had taken up teaching, ethics primarily, at universities, through underground think tanks, via private workshops that never appeared on the record, but every semester they told one story. Not a name, not a file, just a cat. He carried more than data, Julian would say. He carried love, and sometimes that's the only thing more powerful than memory. Emma often played the video of Charlie responding to Francis's final prompt. Not the words, just the way he lifted his head, the deliberate blink, the tail flick. That, she would whisper, was the moment science met soul. Their students never forgot. Back in Kalispell, Mira walked the trails behind her cabin with Charlie nestled in a sling. He no longer ran as he once had, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. As they reached the overlook, Mira paused. Snow blanketed the valley below, endless and clean. a fresh canvas. Charlie meowed softly. Mira laughed. Yes, I remember too. From her pocket she pulled out the old tag. The one with Emily Harrington's name. The beginning of it all. She hung it from the branch of a nearby pine. Let the wind carry the rest. The wind picked up as Mira turned back toward the cabin. Charlie nestled peacefully against her chest. The trail beneath her boots crunched with fresh snow, but her steps were unhurried. There was no urgency left, only presence. And presence was a kind of victory. Back inside, the fire had dimmed, casting a mellow amber hue across the floorboards. Mira placed Charlie on his heated cushion and returned to her journal. She wrote one final sentence before closing the cover. Some lives are lived once, others are remembered into eternity. A knock at the door broke the quiet. It was Grace, bundled in a forest green coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Tea?" she asked. Mira smiled. "Always." As Grace stepped inside, Charlie opened one, and meowed softly, as if acknowledging the sacredness of their gathering. Mira poured 2 cups of oolong and handed one to Grace. "We're being invited to speak in Kyoto," Grace said. "A bioethics summit. They want to understand what it means to store a soul." Mira chuckled. "Tell them they should ask a cat." "I plan to," Grace said. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Outside, the snow fell harder. "What are you going to do with the old drives?" Grace asked, her voice low. Mira didn't answer right away. She walked to the bookshelf, opened a hidden compartment behind a row of philosophy books, and pulled out a small metal box. Inside, the original drives, including Francis's last recorded neural scaffold, the one he had buried in layers of emotion and story. Not code, not numbers, just life, remembered. "I'm going to let him rest," she said. Grace nodded, her fingers curled around the mug. "Then we're finally free." "No," Mira corrected gently. "We're finally responsible." Across the country, other changes were taking place. The Eternum Consortium had splintered. A few members had gone underground. Some were arrested, others vanished entirely. But the memory of what they had done and what Charlie had survived could not be erased. Some of the rescued animals from Eternum's research facilities had found their way to the bridge. Others were adopted into homes that didn't care about their pasts. They just loved them as they were. Julian's lectures were being quoted in academic journals. Emma was tapped to join a UN task force on memory and ethics in AI. And Mira, now known by her birth name once more, Mira Athene Harrington, published a novel under a pseudonym. Its title, The Collar. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the divergence, the town gathered outside the sanctuary. Emily read from a weathered leather journal, the same one that had belonged to Francis. She read not his theories, but his thoughts. "I never meant to be remembered for science," he wrote. "I only hoped that in the end, someone might understand. That love, when held long enough, becomes memory. And memory, when shared, becomes legacy." Charlie sat beside her, purring softly. Mira placed a white rose in the garden that had been built around the old lab collar, now rusted and hanging from a birch branch like a wind chime. Scott stood beside her. "You ever wonder what he would have thought of all this?" he asked. "I think," Mira said slowly, "he would have purred." That night, Mira dreamed, she stood in a vast field of light, and there, in the distance, a man walked toward her. Francis. But not the broken man from the recordings. This one was whole, smiling. A version of him that had never been altered, fragmented, or uploaded. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she answered. "I just came to say thank you," Francis said, "for not letting me disappear, for remembering me, the way I hoped." Mira reached out. "Charlie did most of the work," she said. Francis laughed. "Yeah, He always did. Then he turned, walking back into the light. "Wait," she called. "Will I see you again?" "You already do," he said, fading. "Every time you choose love over fear." She woke with tears on her cheeks and, a smile. Charlie lay curled at her side, watching her with those ancient, endless eyes. She reached out, stroking his fur. "We're still here," she whispered, "and so are you." The next morning, snow covered the world like a clean page. Mira stepped outside with Charlie in her arms. The valley stretched out beneath them, white, vast, and full of possibility. She took a deep breath, her chest rising with the cold air, and then she whispered to the wind, "Remember us." And somewhere in the quiet world, the wind did. So did the earth, and so did Charlie.